This is Robert Capuccio. Welcome to the Self Help Antidote, a weekly dose of reason, perspective, and insight, where we challenge conventional thinking and explore authentic strategies and insights around personal transformation. Our commitment to you is to bring you some of the world's leading experts in the domains of fitness, wellness, coaching, and behavior change, separating fact from fallacy.
Dr. Jon Marion, welcome to the Self Help Antidote.
Thanks so much for having me here, Robert. Happy to be here.
So just a little bit of background on who you are. You have your PhD in psychological anthropology. You were a former instructor at the Somatic School in London, former president of a chapter of the ICF, the International Coach Federation. Those of you who are in the coaching world know what a big deal that is. So it's an honor to have you. I know we've spoken before, and this is going to be a fascinating conversation.
Looking forward to it.
So let me just jump straight in because I have that obnoxious habit of doing so. What do you think from your perspective? And now you've transitioned, you have your own life coaching practice. Congratulations on that. What do you think are some of the most important attributes within a society to create progress and cohesiveness?
Really provocative question. And I think one of the issues is that those two things don't necessarily go together. They can, but cohesiveness just means that it holds together. And that can be for different reasons. It can be chosen affiliation. It can be their reasons that people want to all fit together, but it can also be forced. It can be external pressures, anything from just pure survival to threat. And so that could be cohesive, and that's different from thriving. And so I think we're looking at two different things, and hopefully they're linked together in a healthy way, but there's different issues there.
You know, when you talk about thriving, because I had a conversation with my team the other day, and my team, they're all a lot smarter than I am. Actually, I think that's the case with most of the teams that I've had, probably by default. Anyway, this isn't a therapy session for me. And we were talking about what is the difference between a society, an individual, an organization that languishes versus one that thrives. Because thrive is something that's being used quite ubiquitously. And when that happens, sometimes it loses its meaning. What's your definition for thriving?
Yeah, so I think one of the places where there's already like a little confusion is how does the term society even get used by, in everyday parlance, right? So society is just membership. And so you can decide, who belongs, who doesn't. But once you've set your criteria, So for example, when I was at the university, if we said students, well, do we mean only undergrad? Do we mean graduate? Do we mean part-time? Do we mean full-time? But once we've decided, we know. So that's just about membership. But when we're talking about thriving, I think we're starting to talk about fulfillment. And so it's not just, are you a member or not? But for a society to be thriving, in my mind, it's about, does it actually function in a way that helps people be better than they could be on their own? Does it actually support them to develop and feel comfortable in ways that are important to them and not just that are dictated to them?
Does it help them be better than they could be on their own? That's interesting. In every conversation, there are certain things that land with certain people. And I guess there's a lot of context around that. For me, that's what stood out in what you just said, because on my social media feed, John, it tells me that, other people don't make me better. My internal drives make me better. My discipline makes me better. Who I decide to be makes me better. And environment and the people, that's just excuses. Like, in what ways does society and who we're around affect us that we may not fully appreciate unless we step back and really take a deep, invested view of it?
Yeah, so I think that goes in both directions, because all of those things you just said, they're great things. They're important things for us to show up at our best. But if they're only in the service of yourself, are you really thriving? And if they're not only in the service of you, well, then who else? And so I think we all get the furthest when it's about that we're actually contributing in ways that make an impact. And it has to be on others. It can't just be ourselves. There's the famous quote from Rabbi Hillel, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?
When you say that, it speaks to me because it aligns with one of my beliefs. And I'm not saying that, everything that makes sense has to align with my beliefs. I'm sure I believe a lot of things that are ridiculous. Again, not a therapy session for me. However, I love human beings. We're great. We have a lot of attributes. But let's be honest, compared to a lot of animals, we're fairly slow. And compared to other animals, we're pretty weak. And, rewind, 10, 15, 20,000 years ago, that puts us in a quite precarious position unless we form groups and we can collaborate. And it seems to me that, anytime, and this comes up a lot in business, we love to use military analogies about going to war. And it's like, I hope we don't view our customers in a way where it's a battle and we have to surmount or be victorious, but we also use sports analogies and we use theater a lot, the performing analogy. And you gotta go, why do we use those so often? Well, I think that's because your philosophy shows up. It's evident whether it's a flawed philosophy or efficacious philosophy, and the results are immediate and evident. And it seems to me that wherever we are looking to achieve something great or we are in trouble, it's only through working together that we get there. But you brought up an interesting point. What happens, like, let's say the whole village is threatened by an invader. So not an evader, an invader. An evader is like someone in the village wants to run away. And like, who are we to stop them from living their dreams? But an invader comes in, quite the opposite, and we band together. But what happens once that threat is over? What is it that creates a society where we're driven to be better for ourselves and one another?
Okay, so let's go back to where you commented on that, evolutionarily as a species, slow, weak, and things like that, right? But we didn't just evolve as biological organisms. We're biocultural organisms. And the capacity of humans is for culture, the learned, shared patterns of ideas and behaviors. Because you take an infant, it will die long before it can survive on its own in the human species. Mm-hmm. The whole point is that we have this massive advantage over other species of we can pass along knowledge. We can pass along ideas and patterns and technologies. And so, again, that's not self-sustaining. You can't pass along to yourself. It has to come to you from someone else. If we have to do it all on our own, we cannot compete. The other part of that that's so interesting and important has to do with sort of the speeds of evolution, right? So biological evolution takes place over extended periods of time. Cultural evolution takes place very quickly. And so there's a mismatch. And really, how is it that that's what a lot of what causes stress in society today, that these systems that have evolved to be responses to life-threatening things are the same things, the same, hormones in your body that flood you whenever you're stuck in traffic, whenever your boss wants a report sooner, whenever your kids need to be on opposite sides of town at the same time and there's only one of you. And so it's that mismatch that really becomes precarious and that causes so much stress in our society today.
So that is something that we are hearing more and more. As someone who is a speaker within certain domains, you start to notice patterns, and these could be, it depends on where you're speaking, whether it's international or local. What are the patterns? Like when you're doing a pre-consult and you're trying to figure out what would best serve an audience, what are people asking for? And more, they're like, well, would you come in and talk about burnout? Obviously, they're not talking about, we're fascinated with the subject of burnout. How do we achieve that? They're talking about we're struggling with it, and they're asking about things like resilience. Neuroscience is something where executives are becoming far more interested, where 10 years ago, that would have been a cure for insomnia with that crew. So we're all feeling the pressures of a rapidly changing society. What is it within thriving that allows us to have collective stability in the midst of unprecedented and very often unpredictable change?
This goes back to the question you asked, which is why that was such a good question. And again, if you look at evolution, success, if you will, survival is the exception. Most things die out over time. And when you actually look at the biological record, specialization is not actually the recipe for success long term, because you get so hyper specialized to very particular circumstances that as soon as the ground changes. So yes, it may have been the physical environment, but now it could be the business environment. It could be the cultural environment. It could be the social environment. But if you're so specialized that then things shift, no wonder you're stressed out, because what you have adapted is no longer a good match. And so the same way that actually plasticity is what was most advantageous biologically, and that's part of, humans are not, as you said, strong, fast compared to other things, but we're very plastic. We can actually adapt what we do to many situations. What really allows thriving is the ability to actually pivot, to actually build generalizable skills, generalizable knowledge, not overly specific.
Okay, so you're talking about, and it's kind of complicated, isn't it? Because your job is the half-life of what you know is getting shorter and shorter in terms of its relevance. A lot of times we are knowledge workers, so we have to increase specialization, but specialization, you're saying, comes at the expense of adaptability, and thriving is adaptability, whether it's biological or cultural. So it seems, if I'm understanding you correctly, learning and how we do that by ourselves and how we facilitate that for one another becomes critical to biological systems and cultural systems.
I think so. And yes, there's such an onslaught of information available, and no one could keep up with all of it. But if instead of trying to just get the facts or, the know-how of a given thing, you're looking at, okay, what's the gist of this? If you're actually becoming a specialist in learning, in being able to sort through what's relevant, what's applicable, how can I onboard things, but in a way that you can always update. So rather than trying to sort of generate the most in detail, useful interface, you're actually building on what's my operating system. Is that something that's flexible and fluid? Now we can get somewhere. Sure, the surface result may not be as flashy. It may not even be as functional, but fine. The minute anything changes, what was the most functional before now doesn't work because technology's raced ahead and you were building on a very, very specific system. So if our learning is about how do we keep updating our operating system, how do we actually get better at sorting out what's relevant, what isn't, what actually is in the service of what we want and really care about, as opposed to whatever the metric of the moment is, now we can get somewhere.
Mm. As you're saying this, I'm thinking about something I heard Seth Godin say not too long ago. I don't know how long ago he said it, but I heard him say it not too long ago. And he said management and scalability and reproducible systems and processes are absolutely critical to the success of an organization. So one of the preeminent attributes that an organization needs is effective management until something changes. And then you're dead in the water. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the point he was making. It's like, okay, then leadership becomes critical. So you have an extensive coaching background, more extensive than most. And coaching is one of these things that is so often discussed, but so seldom defined. How does coaching play into leadership and learning for the individual and for an organization differently than traditional training classes or hierarchical flow of information?
Sure. And I really appreciate you asking the question because many people, I mean, obviously people who already are familiar with the field know some of it, but most people, when they hear the word coach, they're thinking sports metaphors. And so they're expecting to be told what to do and to have that information delivered to them as in a typical training or leadership framework with the hierarchy. And the analogy that I was exposed to and that I really has resonated most deeply with me is I'm partnering with you for your own insights. And so the analogy I would use is, taking a hike at night. And I use at night because there's some darkness. If everything's out in the open, if everything's bright, then you already can see all your options. None of us can do that because of life. And you don't need to turn to a coach for everything in your life. It's where is it more challenging? That's where it makes sense to take advantage. So let's say that, as far as rough terrain navigating, you can't hold a flashlight. Well, if I, as the coach, am walking behind you holding a flashlight, it doesn't do any good because your body's in the way of the light. If I'm walking in front of you, leading you, I'm deciding where we go. My job as a coach is to walk right next to you and to shine that flashlight in front and let you decide. I'm just making sure everything's really illuminated and that maybe the things you're not already seeing because you have your own frameworks are really obvious so that you can decide what's best for you. One of the ideas behind coaching is that every client is fully capable, resourceful, intelligent, and they have their own answers. And so to me, this is where my cultural anthropology background really comes in. When I went out and studied a culture, I'm not going in as the expert. I'm going in as the student. I'm learning from them, but I have some objective distance where I can now sort of analyze and then hold it up for others to look at and go, oh, now I understand what's going on. That's what I'm doing as a coach. I'm doing an ethnography, but of an individual. You're the expert in you. I'm just helping us find out, what you're doing and why, so that you can decide how that serves you and what might actually serve you better.
Objective distance. Because as a coach, you, the client, however that shows up, are the expert. That's interesting because you hear so many people call themselves coaches. Like everybody is calling themselves a coach. And it's like one of the things that you hear commonly is, as a coach, I tell people what they need to hear, the hard truth, rather than what they want to hear. And it's like, well, that makes for a really great talk show, but it might not be authentically under the umbrella of coaching, or someone gets promoted to leadership or their level of incompetence, or I don't know, sometimes that's both. That's like, well, clearly I've been promoted because I'm an expert. I have all the answers. So shouldn't the people on my team listen to me? Because if they were as awesome as I was, they would be promoted to my position. What breaks down in that? Like, what could possibly go wrong? And I understand there are times when it's like, hey, follow me. After you've built trust, we need to do this. Trust me, I'll explain later. But day to day, what could break down?
Yeah, well, so there's a huge difference between leadership versus dictatorship. And you were very self-effacing earlier, but I really appreciate, because it was my view of what I was trying to do as a leader, whether of the chapter of the ICF I was briefly president of, whether national organizations when I was still in academia. As a leader, I'm not looking to be the smartest person in the room. That means I'm not actually getting a lot of useful information. My job is to find the other smartest people who have the best specialties, get them in the positions that suit them best, and make sure that they have all the support they need to excel. Now it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. Now we can go further together because we're making sure that the right people are doing the things that are suitable for them and feel supported in doing it. look at what the result of that is going to be versus if it's just all under my framework. And then this comes back to that plasticity. I can only be as open-minded and be aware of as many possibilities as my one brain can. And given whatever things I've internalized from all of my life learning and what I've been told, if I actually make room for all the other voices in an environment that's actually psychologically safe for those to be voiced, look at how many possibilities might be on the table for us to decide between. What are things that maybe even the smartest person in the room wouldn't have thought of, but because they're talking to the others, all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, what if we took this part of yours and this part of the other person's, and we packaged it the way the third person said? Now we have a possibility that never existed before.
I think you're talking about, in a sense, scalability. And scalability is usually relegated to discussions around managerial processes. One way that is insufficient for what you're saying, it doesn't do it justice. But just to kind of craft how I'm thinking about this, if you have 10 people on your team and you believe, well, I got to my position because I work hard, I outwork everyone. Well, if everybody on your team works 40 hours a week and they do their job really well, I know people listen to go 40 hours a week, half day, Bob. It's like, those are like banker's hours. But before you get appalled, right? Let's say they only work 40 hours a week. Collectively, that's 400 hours a week. It is not possible for you to work harder and longer than that because there's only 168 hours in the week. So working through your team and helping them craft their insights and leverage and express their expertise already makes you far more effective than you could ever be on your own. Now you're just talking about time invested. It gets even more complex, and the exponential growth becomes more exaggerated when you're leveraging ideas and backgrounds and perspectives you could not possibly have if on your team everybody agrees as to what game you're actually playing. They have the same vision. They have the same company core values, not meaning what they're motivated the same and what's important to me is identical to what's important to you. But we know the game we're playing. It's not like, okay, half the team shows up to play football, half the team's like, wait, I thought this was basketball. That'll never work. But without leadership and without helping draw out the expertise of your people, you can never get any type of exponential growth through one person.
Absolutely so. And again, I think that's where, if we're looking at what is leadership, right, it's really, amplifying positive impact. I mean, if you're going to do bare bones, other than that, I'm being a manager, a director, I'm being in charge, I'm being a boss. But if I'm leading, I'm maximizing positive impact. And I don't do that by only listening to myself. That's not leading.
So if we brought you into an organization and we said, okay, there is a position that needs to be filled and it's critical. We're looking at these three individuals over here. Would you, as our coaching and leadership consultant, sit down with these three and help us figure out which one of them is most likely to be the most effective leader long term? What would you be looking for? What would that conversation sound like?
Sure. So the first thing is I wouldn't start by sitting down with them. I'd start by sitting down with the people who are already at the company.
Love it.
And figuring out, what is the company even about and where are they trying to go? What is it that as a company is important to them, as an organization is important to them? Why are they bringing on someone? And then, who are all the people who this person might be interacting with? What do they feel would be of support to them and wouldn't? And again, they may not be aware of everything. And that's why I'm talking to people at every level. And only once I know that, I'll go back to, again, whoever's at the head of the process and say, my understanding of what your values are, what the needs are, what the desires are, is this. Do I have that right? And if we get that, is that serving you? Now we can go and talk to those people and figure out, do their styles really align with that? do the way they interact actually align with, the values and what's comfortable within that? So someone could be the biggest expert of those three, but if their way of interacting and guiding and suggesting causes friction with the people they're going to be interacting with, they're not the best person for that job at that organization.
I love that answer. And I love that because you didn't start with the candidates. You started with the people around them, the people who would be impacted, influenced by them, working with them every day. I learned a practice a long time ago. I've been so blessed to have really great teams. And sometimes like the dynamic was challenging and probably I had a lot to do with that, but I've been blessed to have a lot of great teams in my career. And I learned this early. And when I was living in Southeast Asia, I had a particular team that made me particularly fortunate. Let's just put it that way. And one of the practices when I wanted to bring somebody onto that team, I would talk to them, sure. But one of the things that I would do is leave the final decision with the team. So we used to have this place that we used to meet in an auditorium. I love that environment. It was so cool. So we used to not only do our presentations there, we used to meet there. And I would take this candidate and I would put them amongst the entire team and I would leave like it's none of my business. And then I would come back a couple of hours later and, say goodbye to the candidate, thank them, and just sit down and go, okay, let's talk. And my team would make that final decision. And because of that, like every person we brought onto the team, within a week, you would swear they had always been there. The dynamic was so cohesive. And if I said yes to someone, but my team said no, I mean, they're a lot more than me. And I imagine that their collective input probably sees something that I don't. I would listen, no matter how badly I wanted that candidate. Some people might agree or disagree with that, but that was the method that seemed to work for us. I guess another question would be, as you're having your conversations, what would be a disqualifier? What would make you go, wait, okay, aside from this person's style doesn't match with this dynamic, pretty big issue. What would be some of the other things?
The number one that I'm always listening for is if someone says that they know the way, the being singular. I don't care what domain it is in life. Anyone who tells you they know the way to do something is a scary human being. Run for the hills. If they want to say, I have something that works for me and I'd love to share it, or I, think it might really support you, great. But anyone who says that they have the answer is incredibly closed-minded and is about promoting their own worldview, not about actually helping anyone else.
That's the antithesis of coaching. It's interesting though. I see that more and more. I see people with an absolute sense of certainty who have already made up their mind before they're even presented with information. The question I've had for people is, okay, will you believe this? And I have very strong point of views. One of my coaches, actually improv coaches, helped me with that. He was like, you need a strong point of view sometimes in a dynamic to bring out other people's point of view because they have nothing to contrast off of. But you got to be willing to let go of that point of view. So have strong point of views held very loosely. And I love that. But what would it take for you to change your perspective? And it's surprising how many times I hear nothing because I know my perspective is right. And I don't know how much of that is arrogance. And I don't know how much of that is fear. Like the world is changing around me and I don't really understand it. And so I'm just going to cling to this reality construct for some type of certainty.
Yeah. So I think that was one of the things that was always interesting when I was instructing like newer students to cultural anthropology, right? Because it's nature. It makes sense. We all do it until we're exposed to something else. The way we experience the world is the way we think it is. And that is more universal than is fact. And the way I pointed out is this: no one on the planet wakes up in the morning, thinks about something, goes, that makes no sense to me. I'm going to go do it. They may think it sucks. They may think it's terrible, but I guarantee you they still think it's the best option they have available based on everything they know, or they choose something different. So there is a logic. And so if instead of approaching different points of view with that very accusatory, how could you think that? We're doing it with true curiosity and inquisitiveness. How can you think that? Because there is a how, there is a reason. And it doesn't mean I need to agree with you, but if I am willing to accept that whatever you're thinking and doing is pure, fully logical to you, then I can actually start to understand. Now we can build some bridges.
Okay. There's a direction I'd like to take this conversation. There's many directions I'd like to take this conversation, but where I'm landing is I've heard the conversation amongst professionals that, okay, I don't think anybody should be coaching unless they've been trained for years. And I heard a friend of mine at a conference, and he's a neuroscientist. He's like, whoa, hold on. I would rather someone who understands their scope of practice have a little bit of coaching skills and perspective interact with someone than someone who is like, nope, this is the way. To your point, when you're talking about, because you hear that someone says something on social media, and it's like, how many layers in the conversation do you go before you get to insults and character attacks and defamation? Usually it's one. It's like, obviously you're uneducated. It's like, well, hold on. Nobody said your God is false, and nobody said your baby was ugly. There's never like, okay, so what I hear you saying is this. Wow, I'm curious. Let me ask that. What does a coaching-based culture look like? And how might that start to shift the dynamic between people when you have two rigid worldviews colliding, which seems to happen more and more, if that's a fair question?
Well, if it's the question on your mind, then it's fair to ask, right? So it is, anything question is a fair question.
Fair point. Okay, yeah, cool. Thanks.
So I think, and it goes to part of the answer too, which is anything that catches your attention deserves your attention. So if that's what caught your attention as far as a question, then there's something there. Mm-hmm. And I think a coaching-based perspective is going to acknowledge that if there are things that people feel very strongly about, well, then there's a reason for it. And it's not just that this person by nature has a limited worldview. It's no, they have a background, they have an experience that has led them to this. And I may disagree on every single count, but I'm never going to bridge anything. There's never the possibility of understanding, let alone connection or communication, if I'm just dismissing it. If I go into it with, what's the background behind this? And I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying it's a panacea. I'm not saying that it's going to work all the time. But there's no chance without it. So when I used to teach a class on culture and medicine, I was introducing like cultural anthropology concepts, but to nursing programs, to pre-med, to medical humanities. And again, it's not going to work with every patient who they encounter, but it's giving them tools so that they can at least extend that bridge. They can build it. And sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't, but it'll never work if you never build it. And so I think that's the thing. It would be ludicrous. It would be the height of hubris for me to say, if we approach it this way, we'll all get along. I wish it's not true. But I can always have an intention for myself, not for how anyone else is going to respond, but how do I want to show up? And do I want to show up in a way that invites some of those bridges, makes it possible? So with that coaching mindset of every person is fully intelligent, capable, resourceful, they don't need to be told anything. They need to be supported to have insights, to grow. Now we can get somewhere.
So it starts with, who do I want to be? How do I want to show up? Not just for me as an example of who I am, but who are other people for me? I think that's really important what you're saying there.
Yeah, the part of it that you just said that is the most resonant for me is, how do I want to be? And that's sort of at the core of all of my practice. And there's amazing work out there on the importance of meaning. You can go back to Viktor Frankl and logotherapy, and that even in the most atrocious of human circumstances, what determines survival versus not is finding meaning, and not the meaning, but that you find a meaning for yourself. And, recently all of Simon Sinek's amazing work on, start with why. But in the moment, when you're faced with all of those competing pressures in life, when maybe your emotions are running rampant, sometimes it's too hard to get in touch with your why or your meaning. Mm-hmm. I can always get in touch with, how do I want to be showing up right here and now? How do I want to be, whether it's in this job, with this partner, in this very conversation we're having? How do I want to be? If I do that consistently and I build a habit of that, then I live a life of being how I want to be.
So there's this intention, and what got me there is like, okay, sometimes when you're in the midst of, I'm constantly asking myself, how do I want to be? Who do I want to be? How do I want to show up? Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'm aligned, and sometimes I fail epically. Like when I'm thinking about that before going to a meeting, and on my way to the office, well, I'm driving down the road. It's carnage out there. And something happens on the road, and I'm like, wait, what happened to how you wanted to be? Is there a practice that we could all implement in those moments that anchor us to that when we know how we want to show up, but we just don't want to because we're in a state of anger, fear, agitation, any type of emotion that takes us out of that intention?
Yeah, I think it's a multi-part answer, because there's not one right answer. I'm also not going to say the answer is, right? I just told you to not trust anyone who does that. So you did mention mindfulness, and I want to be really clear. Lots of people have probably heard of mindfulness and mindfulness practices, and they're all great. Any of them that work for you are great, but they don't need to be these complicated things. The point is that our minds can be in the past, they can be in the future. Our bodies can only be right here and now. So if you just start with something that uses your senses, that's a embodied experience. So if you're driving, actually really pay attention to your hands on the steering wheel and touch it with one hand, squeeze as tight as you can and release it. Another hand, how lightly can you actually move your fingers over the steering wheel so you feel the ridges in your fingertips? You're going to be right here and now. That's going to do something for your nervous system. Another practice, exhale as deeply as you can. Too many people say, oh, take a breath. If we're already nervous, if we're already agitated, if we're already constricted, how much oxygen can you take in? Exhale as deeply as you can. Now you can take a breath. Now you can get oxygen in the blood, oxygen to the brain. Take that deep breath in, hold it for an extra few seconds before you exhale. It's like giving a hug to yourself as far as your vagal system. And so all of a sudden we're starting to regulate the nervous system. Now we can start to go, okay, how do I want to be? And the third sort of element to the answer that I would give is, it's what I call future casting. And to me, that is sort of doing the version of, okay, what does 5 years from now, Jonathan, going to have wanted to have said or done in this moment? Looking back on this, how am I going to have wanted to show up? And I really I didn't have the label yet, but I stumbled into this in early 2020. And the time was in what had to that point been the most meaningful, rewarding romantic relationship in my life. And it came to an end, and it caught me a little bit off guard. And I remember sitting in the chair in the middle of this conversation with these tears streaming down my face, but somehow I had the awareness I'm not going to have this moment to do over. And so I just asked her, give me 1 minute. And I just really thought about that. And I didn't have the label future casting yet, but it was looking back at this, how am I going to have wanted to show up right here and now? And so what I ended up saying to her was, look, despite, being really caught off guard and upset and sad in this moment, I just want to thank you for this amazing relationship, all of the amazing experiences we shared, and more than anything else, for just being you. And wasn't easy to say, given everything involved, but it was really simple to get in touch with when I was willing to look at it that way. And I have zero regrets about how I handled that. And so in those most overwhelming moments, use any of those tactile practices, use that exhale first. And then when it's too overwhelming in the moment, whether because of competing pressures, deep emotions, looking back on this, how am I going to have wanted to show up? Now you have a way to go forward.
Well, first of all, that is quite vulnerable and generous to share. So thank you. And secondly, what I'm hearing is intentions are critical. And it's a place to start. But you also need processes, tools, and practices to be able to channel those intentions into congruent behaviors when things shift or when your environment or situation puts you in not the most resourceful state you'd like to be in. Talk to us a little bit about your being framework and how that shows up and why that's important.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So what we were just talking about, what has been a thread throughout so far, is how do I want to show up? How do I want to be in the moment? And so a lot of what we've been talking about are like sort of tactical level frameworks. But in what direction are we aiming that? Again, I recognize I'm using some of those military metaphors you mentioned before, tactical aiming.
They work.
Yep. And so using that framework, I would say there's a strategic piece for me, and that is my being framework. And again, I think so much of the stress in our society and so much of the turmoil is we're living in a world where it's all about accomplishment and doing and these external measures and these shoulds that we hear. And should is fighting with what is. So instead of my boss should recognize my work, my kids should listen to me, I should go to the gym, just cross that out, replace it with could. My boss could listen to me. My kids could listen to me. I could go to the gym. Now I can decide what I want to do. And so how do we figure out what that is? Well, we're human beings, not human doings. So we need to do things, we need to accomplish things. But if we're starting from there, I think we're putting the cart before the horse. So I use being as an acronym. So B is for begin where you are. All too often when we know we want change or something to be different, we rush to change without ever really taking stock of where are we. And so I don't care if you're looking at the GPS in your car, if you're looking at a paper map, if you're on your phone on Google Maps or iMaps or whatever, if you don't have a signal, if you don't have a pin that says you are here, you can't navigate anywhere. Mm-hmm. So take stock. What are the opportunities? What are the constraints? What are the skills? What are the backgrounds, the resources? Begin where you are. E, explore where you want to go. All too often, we're pursuing the things that we're sort of told we should want. The promotion, the bigger office, the bigger house, whatever it is. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but are they really the things that matter to you most? Maybe that promotion comes with job responsibilities that you really don't want. Maybe it comes with time commitments that don't let you give time to what matters to you more. And you really need to weigh it out and not let it be about what anything external suggests should be your values. Mm-hmm. So begin where you are, explore where you want to go. I is really for investigate how you're going to get between them. And there's so many pathways. Do you want the most efficient route? Do you want the scenic route? Do you want to be able to visit people along the way? And I think the other part of that that's so important, and that I ask all of my clients, whether it's individuals or organizations, I ask them to make 2 lists on both sides of a piece of paper. One, of all the big decisions you've made up till now, which ones have been the most fulfilling, the most significant in a positive way, and which ones have worked out the least well that you maybe regret or wish you'd handled differently. Now identify, how did you make each of those decisions? For one person, it might be they listened to their gut. For someone else, pro and con list. Someone else talked to friends and family who know them well and got their input. So first, identify how you make the decisions that you are happiest with. Now apply that to identifying which route you want to take between where you are and where you want to go. So begin where you are, explore where you want to go, investigate how you're going to get there that's the way that's best for you, and now start. All too often, we get so caught up in trying to get it right, trying to account for everything. Life happens. You can't account for everything. But if you understand where you were starting, where you're trying to get to, and why you chose the route you did, you can always adapt. If I'm going home and there's a detour because of road construction, I'm not lost. I'm just taking a detour. By the same token, if I'm driving somewhere and I see a sign that says, it's only half a mile to the world's largest, frying pan based on the Guinness Book of World Records, and I'm like, I'm not in a rush. That's cool. Why not? I'm not lost. I took a detour, and it's not a problem because I know where I'm going and I know, why I'm going the way I am. I can always pivot. And I never get that chance if I don't actually start. And then the final piece, G, is forget your best life. And that's not that it's you're now at a final destination. It's you've actually traveled so far. You're so much different as far as where you're at. And what are the capacities, the skills, the experiences you've added to your toolkit to get there? So you could also say G in some ways is for gratitude. It's consolidating. It's saying, look at all of this stuff that I now have and can use going forward for picking a new destination at any point if I choose, for, following a different goal. So begin where you are, explore where you want to go, investigate how you're going to get there, now start, and then actually get the results from it. Works for individuals, works for organizations.
When you think about the question, who am I being, that provides a framework and a channel for that thought process. Thank you. I've gotten so much out of this conversation. Really enjoyed talking to you each time. Thank you for being here with us.
Absolutely my pleasure, being the way I want to be and being that way with you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Visit us at theselfhelpantidote.com to share your feedback, insights, and recommendations on what topics you'd like us to explore in the future.